Mr. President, Amazon paid $75 million to make and market this film. It's an exorbitant fee. Many Americans think that this is maybe Jeff Bezos trying to get in good with you, and they would call it an act of corporate corruption. The New York Times.
The New York Times is fake news. New York Times. No, I don't know. I mean, I don't know really. I'm not involved in that. That was done with my wife. I think it's going to be. I think it's a very important movie. I think it's really going to be.
When a president says, "I'm not involved," most people hear a denial. They hear distance. They hear a line being drawn between public office and private money. But sometimes that sentence is not a denial. Sometimes it's a tell. On a red carpet in Washington, under bright lights and cameras, Donald Trump was asked a simple question. Amazon paid $75 million to produce and market a film about the First Lady. Is that corporate corruption? Is Jeff Bezos trying to get in good with you? Trump said he didn't know, said he wasn't involved, said it was his wife's deal. And then minutes later, he admitted he was sort of in it. He analyzed Amazon's market power. He called them close to a monopoly. He said, "We'll see how it all works." That sequence is not random. It's a window into how power and profit are now operating together in plain sight. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The president regulates Amazon. The payment went to his wife. The film is about the White House. And when confronted, he denied involvement while describing his involvement. That's not just messaging. That's the slow collapse of a boundary. If you believe the line between presidential authority and personal enrichment still matters, stay with me. This is bigger than a movie premiere.
Thank you.
Mr. President, you have a TV and film background. Did you have any input or any say on the creative direction? Yeah, on this one.
I would say, yeah, I mean, other than the fact that I'm in it, I'm sort of in it, but I would say that basically this was her baby, and it's her views, it's her feel, and she's done a great job. I think you're going to really like it. You're going to love this movie. This is a really good movie. It's a beautiful movie. It's a documentary of sorts, but it explains the White House. You'll see.
There was a time in this country when the appearance of profit around a president was enough to trigger alarms. Not proof of a crime, not a conviction, just the appearance. After Watergate, Congress did not wait for another burglary to rethink the rules. Lawmakers looked at how power had been used, how loyalty had been purchased, how money had quietly shaped decisions, and they built guardrails, disclosure rules, divestment expectations, ethics offices, inspectors general. The idea was simple. If you hold public power, you do not cash in on it. Not while you're in office, not through your family, not through side channels. It wasn't about purity, it was about insulation, insulating public decisions from private incentives. Presidents sold assets, or placed them in blind trusts, or at minimum created distance. The distance mattered. Even when enforcement was imperfect, the expectation was clear. You do not monetize proximity to the Oval Office. Then came the first Trump term. He didn't divest. He didn't create a blind trust. He kept ownership. Hotels, golf courses, licensing deals, foreign governments booked rooms, political groups held events at his properties. His children remained tied to the business ecosystem orbiting his name. Ethics experts objected. Lawsuits were filed, Congress debated, but nothing truly stopped it. And something important happened in that moment. The shock faded, the outrage dulled, the lack of consequence became precedent. When institutions fail to enforce a boundary, the boundary doesn't stay blurry, it disappears. Now fast forward, second term, same president, different scale. Instead of hotel bookings, we are looking at a $75 million payment, not to Trump directly, to the First Lady, for a film that, by their own description, documents the transition back into the White House. A film about official duties, about policy initiatives, about life inside the executive branch. This is not a memoir written years after leaving office. This is not a post-presidency media contract like other former leaders have signed. This is happening while the regulatory power of the presidency is active. And the company writing the check is Amazon, a corporation facing antitrust scrutiny, a corporation competing for federal contracts, a corporation whose cloud infrastructure hosts government data, a corporation whose business model is shaped by agencies that ultimately answer to the president. That context matters more than the red carpet glamour. Because the question isn't whether Melania Trump is allowed to produce content. She is. The question is whether a sitting president's immediate family can receive tens of millions of dollars from a company subject to that president's regulatory authority without triggering serious institutional response? And so far, the answer appears to be yes. No emergency ethics review. No congressional hearing announced. No bipartisan statement of concern. Just a premiere, a speech, applause, and a denial of involvement. That's the shift. The story isn't just about a payment. It's about the normalization of overlap between executive power and private enrichment. When Trump says, "I'm not involved," he's not just defending himself in a moment. He's signaling something larger. He's signaling that the old guardrails are optional, that disclosure is enough, that comparison to other presidents is enough, that calling something fake news is enough. And here's the deeper issue. If $75 million can move from a regulated corporation to the president's household without consequence, what is the upper limit? Is there one? That's the context we have to hold before we even get into the details of what was said that night. Because this isn't about optics. It's about the architecture of accountability. Now let's slow down and look at what actually happened that night. Not the spin, not the applause, the words. A reporter asked directly about the $75 million. Not vaguely, not indirectly. He stated the amount. He raised the concern that many Americans see it as a way for Jeff Bezos to get favorable treatment. He used the phrase corporate corruption. Trump's first move was reflexive. Fake news, the New York Times, delegitimized the source. Then came the denial. I don't know really. I'm not involved in that. That was done with my wife. Clear, clean, supposedly definitive. But the problem with lying in real time is that the rest of the conversation still exists. Minutes later, he was asked whether he had creative input on the film. His answer? I would say yeah, other than the fact that I'm in it, I'm sort of in it. That is not a man detached from a project. That is not someone with zero involvement. That is someone acknowledging participation while pretending it doesn't count. You cannot be uninvolved and sort of in it at the same time. Those statements cannot coexist without one being false. Then there's the financial awareness. If he truly didn't know about the deal, he would have said exactly that. I have no idea what Amazon paid. Instead, he defended the payment. He compared it to Obama's post-presidency deals. He said others have been paid a lot of money too. That is someone who understands the scale. Someone who anticipates criticism. Someone prepared with a comparative argument. Ignorance doesn't prepare rebuttals. And then he went further. He didn't just mention Amazon, he assessed them. It looks to me like one is very much a monopoly if they're able to do this deal. That's not casual commentary. That's a regulatory observation. Antitrust language. Monopoly status is not a cultural label. It's a legal one. An enforcement authority over monopolies runs through agencies that ultimately report to him. Then came the line that should have stopped the room cold. We'll see how it all works. Think about that. The President of the United States, discussing a corporation that paid his wife $75 million, says we'll see how it all works. Works in what sense? Works legally? Works financially? Works regulatorily? It's vague enough to avoid direct admission, but precise enough to imply leverage. And the context gets tighter when you bring in Melania Trump's own words. She did not describe the project as a purely private venture disconnected from government. She said it shows what it takes to become First Lady again. She talked about establishing the East Wing. She talked about legislative initiatives. She talked about advising her husband. She talked about planning a White House summit with world leaders. This film is about power. It is about governance. It is about proximity to executive authority. Trump himself called it a modern-day history of the White House. So let's put the pieces together plainly. The president denies involvement. He admits involvement. He defends the payment amount. He labels the paying corporation a monopoly. He suggests future regulatory evaluation. He confirms his wife influences administration policy. She confirms they consult. The product being sold is access to life inside the executive branch. None of these facts alone prove a quid pro quo. That's not the point. The point is structural conflict. When a corporation facing federal oversight pays the president's immediate household tens of millions of dollars for content about the presidency, that is not neutral. And when the president's first instinct is to deny involvement, then pivot, then flood the zone with unrelated claims about crime and gas prices, that tells you something. It tells you he understands the danger of the question. Because if this were clean, the answer would have been simple. Yes, Amazon bought the rights. The terms are public. Here's why it doesn't affect my administration. Instead, we got contradiction. And contradiction is not accidental. It's defensive. This is where the escalation begins. Because now the issue isn't just money. It's credibility. Watch what happens right after the contradiction. The reporter raises corruption. Trump denies involvement. Then, instead of staying on the subject, he detonates a barrage of unrelated claims. Border closed. Crime at an all-time low. Gas prices down. Election interference in Georgia. Military strength. Cabinet meetings. Transparency. It's not random. It's tactical. When a question threatens the legitimacy of a financial arrangement, the safest move is not to argue the details. It's to bury the question under volume. Shift the emotional temperature. Move from ethics to patriotism, from money to security, from corporate payments to crime statistics. This isn't new. It's a pattern. Flood the zone. Overwhelm the room. Make the original question feel small compared to national crises. And notice something else. When he pivots back to the film, he doesn't describe it as a private family documentary. He elevates it. It shows life in the White House. It's a modern-day history. Our country needs glamour. Glamour. That word matters. He reframes the transaction not as a corporate deal, but as cultural restoration. Not money, but pageantry. Not profit, but national image. It's smart messaging, but it doesn't change the structural reality. Because the White House is not a movie set. It is a government institution funded by taxpayers. The symbolism of the presidency is not private property to be monetized while the presidency is active. And the more you listen to Melania Trump's interviews, the harder it becomes to maintain the fiction that this is separate from governance. She says she was deeply involved in production, lead producer, post-production decisions, music selection, marketing rollout. She describes launching a production company. A docuseries is coming next. This isn't a one-off. It's a platform. She also describes legislative initiatives, AI policy, child protection efforts, a global summit at the White House, ongoing policy work. That is a fusion of roles: business executive, policy influencer, first lady, content producer, all operating simultaneously. And here's the uncomfortable question no one in that room forced into the open. If Amazon were under aggressive antitrust review tomorrow, could anyone confidently say that the $75 million deal plays zero role in how that review unfolds? Not hypothetically, practically. Because influence doesn't require a phone call that says, "You owe me." Influence can exist as unspoken awareness, as caution, as hesitation, as softened enforcement. That's how modern corruption works. It doesn't scream, it whispers. Trump calling Amazon a monopoly while also accepting the largest documentary payment in history from them is not coincidence. It's leverage language. It's signaling. And the institutions that would normally interrogate that signal are quiet. Congress has not announced hearings. The ethics apparatus has no enforcement power over him. The party in power has shown no appetite to challenge him. So the premiere becomes precedent. The applause becomes normalization. And what was once considered scandalous becomes simply another headline in a very loud news cycle. But here's where the stakes widen. If this is acceptable, then every corporation now understands the model. You don't need to lobby aggressively. You don't need secret meetings. You create legitimate business arrangements with the president's family. Streaming deals, speaking contracts, licensing partnerships, production investments. You pay market value, or above it, and when questioned, the president calls it fake news. That's not theoretical. That's what we watched happen. The escalation isn't just about money. It's about the message sent to every powerful corporate actor watching that red carpet. The message is simple. The door is open. Now we move from optics to structure, because none of this exists in a vacuum. There is a constitutional framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. The founders were not naive about money. They were deeply suspicious of it, especially foreign money, especially corporate influence, especially payments flowing toward people who wield executive authority. That is why the Constitution contains the emoluments clauses, one domestic, one foreign. The core idea is straightforward. A federal office holder cannot accept payments, gifts, or benefits from external entities if those benefits could compromise independence. It doesn't require proof of a signed contract promising favorable treatment. It requires recognition of conflict, of incentive distortion. Now, here is the problem. The president is largely exempt from the standard conflict of interest statutes that apply to every other federal employee. Cabinet members must divest or recuse. Agency heads must disclose. Career officials are fired for far less. The president? Enforcement is political, not criminal. which means the only real accountability mechanisms are Congress and voters. And we already know how Congress handled this in the first term. Trump kept his business empire intact. Foreign dignitaries stayed at his properties. Lawsuits were filed alleging violations of the Emoluments Clause. The cases dragged. Congress declined to center impeachment around financial conflicts. And eventually, the term ended without resolution. The lesson was clear. The constitutional guardrail exists on paper, but it has no teeth unless political actors are willing to use them. So now we arrive at the Amazon payment. This is not a hotel room booking, not an event space rental, not a licensing deal buried in paperwork. This is $75 million, publicly celebrated, for a project centered on the presidency itself, during an active term. And when confronted, the president denied involvement before acknowledging it. That matters legally, because when you combine financial benefit with regulatory authority, the risk is not theoretical. Amazon is subject to antitrust enforcement. The Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice oversee monopoly investigations. Both operate within the executive branch. Leadership appointments flow from the president. Trump publicly identified Amazon as potentially monopolistic. He acknowledged their scale, then said, "We'll see how it all works." That phrase now carries weight. If Amazon receives favorable regulatory treatment, critics will point to the $75 million. If Amazon faces harsh enforcement, defenders will claim the payment proves independence. Either way, the regulatory process is contaminated by perception, and perception is not trivial. It shapes public trust. But the legal complication deepens because the payment did not go directly to Trump. It went to his wife. This is the structural workaround. Payments routed through family members create plausible deniability. They allow a president to say, "I'm not involved," even if influence is obvious, even if proximity is undeniable. And Melania Trump is not detached from governance. She described legislative initiatives, White House summits, policy advocacy. She acknowledged advising the president. Trump confirmed her influence inside the administration. So we are not talking about a private spouse uninvolved in public affairs. We are talking about an active participant in the political ecosystem receiving a massive payment from a regulated corporation. That is textbook conflict territory. And here's what makes it more dangerous than a one-time violation. There is no immediate institutional response. No bipartisan ethics inquiry announced. No special counsel. No congressional oversight hearing scheduled. The absence of reaction becomes permission. And when permission is implied, escalation follows. Because if $75 million generates no consequence, the next transaction can be larger, more creative, more insulated. The Emoluments Clause was designed to prevent foreign kings from buying American loyalty. But modern corporate empires are no less powerful. Influence doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a logo. And right now, the enforcement mechanism that was supposed to defend against this scenario is largely political, which means the next stage of this story isn't legal. It's institutional. Now we have to zoom out, because if this were only about one documentary deal, the story would be narrow. Controversial, yes, but contained. It's not contained. When a sitting president's household can receive $75 million from a corporation subject to federal oversight, and the only immediate response is a red carpet celebration, something structural has shifted. Think about the incentives this creates. Every major corporation in America now understands the template. You do not need to request a private meeting. You do not need to make explicit demands. You do not need a paper trail that says, in exchange for this payment, we expect favorable treatment. You structure a legitimate commercial agreement. You pay market value or above market value. You celebrate it publicly. You frame it as culture, storytelling, glamour, and the president calls questions about it fake news. That is a clean system from a legal standpoint. There's no smoking gun memo, no envelope of cash, no wire transfer labeled bribe. It's corporate influence redesigned for the streaming era. And here's the deeper problem. Enforcement bodies operate on proof. They operate on documented quid pro quo. But modern influence rarely leaves that kind of footprint. It operates through awareness. If Amazon knows that its regulatory fate ultimately passes through an administration financially connected to its executives, behavior adjusts. If regulators know that their president's family has accepted an unprecedented payment from a company they are investigating, caution adjusts. Aggression softens. Tone changes. Meetings feel different. You do not need a phone call. The structural incentive is enough. And we cannot ignore the broader environment in which this is happening. Inspectors general were previously fired when they investigated too aggressively. Congressional oversight has been partisan and inconsistent. The ethics office has advisory power, not enforcement power. The judiciary has shown reluctance to wade deeply into presidential financial conflicts. That leaves public pressure. But public pressure requires sustained attention. And sustained attention is hard when the news cycle is deliberately flooded with other claims. Remember what happened on that red carpet. Corruption question raised. Immediate pivot to crime rates, border policy, gasoline prices, election grievances. The move wasn't random. It was strategic dilution. And dilution works. The more chaotic the information environment becomes, the harder it is to isolate and sustain focus on a structural conflict. Meanwhile, Melania Trump described future projects, a docuseries, a production company, more content. This isn't a single deal. It's an infrastructure for ongoing monetization of proximity to power. If one company paid $75 million, what stops another from paying $100 million or $150? And once that becomes normalized, what is the ceiling? The international implications are even more volatile. If domestic corporations can structure deals like this, foreign corporations can too. Sovereign wealth funds, state-owned enterprises, international media conglomerates. All it takes is a creative contract. The founders worried about foreign monarchs sending gifts. Today, influence can be delivered through streaming rights and marketing budgets. And we are watching this happen not in secret, but in celebration. This is the escalation stage. Not because a crime has been proven, but because the precedent is being built in plain sight. And once precedent hardens, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Here is where this story does not resolve. Because there is no dramatic reveal coming, no midnight indictment, no sudden bipartisan awakening. What we are watching is slower than that, more structural, more durable. A boundary has been tested. It did not hold. A massive payment flowed from a corporation subject to federal oversight into the president's household. The president denied involvement, then acknowledged involvement, then reframed the entire conversation as spectacle. The event continued. The film premiered. The system absorbed it. That absorption is the real headline. When something once considered disqualifying becomes survivable, the next version becomes easier. When the first large payment triggers outrage but no enforcement, the second payment triggers less outrage. The third becomes routine. Corruption in modern democracies rarely announces itself with sirens. It settles in. It blends with entertainment. It wraps itself in cultural language. It calls itself glamour. It calls itself storytelling. It calls itself business. And each time the line is crossed without consequence, the definition of the line shifts. The constitutional clauses are still written. The ethics offices still exist. Congress still has authority. But authority unused decays. Norms unenforced erode. Public tolerance adapts. This is not about proving a direct exchange of favors. It is about the architecture that allows exchange to become plausible without ever being explicit. If Amazon receives favorable treatment in future antitrust decisions, the $75 million will linger in the background. If Amazon faces strict enforcement, defenders will point to that enforcement as proof of independence. Either way, the regulatory process is now contaminated by the perception of financial entanglement. And perception is not cosmetic. It is foundational to legitimacy. The presidency relies on the belief that decisions are made in the public interest, not influenced by private gain. Once that belief fractures, restoring it is harder than passing any single law. The more this pattern repeats, the more corporations adjust their strategy. The more family members become conduits. The more public office blends into private enterprise. It does not end with one film. It does not end with one deal. It continues through the next contract, the next partnership, the next carefully structured arrangement that can be defended as legal while reshaping the incentives behind executive power. The question is no longer whether this moment was controversial. The question is what happens when it becomes ordinary. And that answer has not been written yet.